Hello, friends, and welcome to Usana's Dialogues. Hello, friends, and welcome to Usana's Dialogues. Today, we are going to have a very interesting discussion on a topic, on an issue that has actually disturbed the peace of the world, and we are going to explore the future of the U.S. presence in the Middle East: decline, adaptation, or reinvention. And today we are joined by an eminent expert, Mr. Daniel Benem. Daniel Benem is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs, and he's a distinguished diplomatic fellow with the Middle East Institute and a former senior presidential speechwriter. So, yes, we have the best man and a veteran and an expert to enlighten us on most of these complex and critical issues. A very, very warm welcome to you, Daniel.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
So, as we see that the peace in the Middle East and the ceasefire process looks as unpredictable as Donald Trump's temperament. So, we are all quite perturbed, not just the strategic community, but also the lay watchers of geopolitics. So, within that context, I want your thoughts on what is going to be the future of the US in the Middle East. Are they going to
Yeah,
withdraw? Are they going to redefine their relationships with the Arab states?
no, look, it's a great question. And one of the things that is so maddening for the rest of the world about dealing with the United States right now is that we have these different windows of certainty. We know that Donald Trump will be president for the next 2.5 years. We don't know who will be president after that. And whether it's J.D. Vance, who seems to be more skeptical of American engagement in the Middle East, or a Democrat who may have other priorities that they feel needed to be corrected when it came to U.S. Middle East engagement, it's just hard to plan with us, is the reality these days, in a way that was less true when there was more of a bipartisan consensus on these issues. That said, let me offer a few thoughts about where we are. First, I think this war was ill-considered and has proven very costly to the United States and the global economy strategically. Um, there's not an obvious exit plan, and that leaves the United States in a very difficult position, and it has had major ramifications for countries everywhere, from the price of fertilizer to the ability to keep an office open 5 days a week in some countries. So that's a major disruption, and as far as I'm concerned, a bit of a black mark when it comes to U.S. leadership, to have created that disruption without a very serious plan to achieve a vitally important strategic goal. This is why people are very skeptical of wars of choice. Even if Iran was a very serious and enduring threat, I think for the United States, this was a war of choice, was chosen by the president. So we're in a bad spot. We're working to find ways to create leverage for what would hopefully be a diplomatic outcome that addresses some of the issues that caused the war, which were indeed quite serious issues. At least the nuclear program, which is not urgent but is very important, and the Strait of Hormuz, which is urgent and is an emerging condition of the war. Some of the other issues like missiles and proxies, I think, will have to just be dealt with using other tools, because Iran was probably not ready to negotiate over them in the ways that the Trump administration would want. So we're in a bit of a mess. In terms of where it leaves us, however, I think actually the facts are somewhat surprising. I think that the U.S. liabilities have been kind of well broadcast. We don't always take others' advice. We're far away. We have an ability to break things and then kind of not take responsibility to put them back together. Colin Powell talked about what he called the Pottery Barn rule, which was you break it and you own it. And I think it's that rule has been kind of abandoned by Donald Trump and the United States. And look, other American presidents have counseled restraint. But what's notable is that for 20 years of talking about going and moving to the Indo-Pacific and leaving behind the Middle East and leaving behind Europe, the truth is we're going to need a significant presence in these three theaters. We're not in a position to abandon the Middle East. I think this war showed very clearly that the global economy is extraordinarily dependent on hydrocarbons, which are in many cases priced globally, or certainly priced in a way that our allies face tremendous pain over them when it comes to gas. Oil's global, gas is it's a serious issue regardless. So but other inputs like fertilizers, like the price of helium that goes into semiconductors, and other petrochemical byproducts, sulfur, these are things that actually end up being incredibly important that travel through these straits. We just, I think, have shown that we're not in a position to leave. Uh, Sometimes people suggest that we would leave when we had achieved some kind of durable peace. Sometimes people suggest we could leave and just let others sort it out. I think we've shown pretty definitively that neither of those really works and that the United States is a vital element. So that is on the all of the ugliness of the president's statements, all of the erratic qualities of decision making to create short-term leverage. Those are all very clear and public. On the other hand, the enduring strengths of the United States are kind of understated. Um, the presidential advisor in the UAE, Anwar Gargash, is one of the better strategic thinkers in the entire region. Um, he had a wonderfully succinct way of putting it. He said, the missiles that attacked us were Iranian, and the forces that helped us were American. So I think that the Gulf states, at least, had a clearer understanding of the Iranian threat, and they understood that if Iran were to respond to an event like this by bombing them unprovoked, then that means that they probably always faced a threat from Iran. And the fact is that the US uniquely helped them to secure their skies means that even if in every strategic studies program, in every Gulf capital, there will be a paper about a post-American Middle East, in every royal palace, there will be a recognition that US military forces actually helped the United States to navigate and dispatch this threat, even if America should be in part blamed for having unleashed this threat in a way that I think is quite irresponsible. So you have a paradox. We also, I think, benefit from the fact that when you look around, right now, at least, there's nowhere to go for the Gulf states. Détente with Iran, which they may have to do, is kind of a losing play. Um, China is mostly interested in exporting its own goods. It's been strikingly disinterested in taking on security commitments, as was evident by the fact that Iran has now been bombed twice in a year. And despite a $400 billion purported economic partnership with China, they've been mostly kind of around the edges, trying to be a bit of a provocateur, a bit of an arsonist, a bit of a firefighter, giving targeting about our bases, but then also offering their good offices, alongside Pakistan. So that is kind of that's not a real alternative, and neither is Russia, which is very preoccupied with its own war of choice in Ukraine. You get down to the sort of minilateral players who are very important and interesting powers of different kinds: France, UK, Korea, Japan, including India. Um, what you have is a bunch of very important and interesting economies that are huge economic partners, bigger than the United States, but where on the highest shelf of strategic assets, whether it's defense or technology, um, it's still mostly the US and China are sitting at that table, uniquely able to provide or not some of those things. And for the Gulf, it's really the US. So I think you will see a more multilateral region and a more multilateral and multipolar and kind of polyphonic Middle East, let's say, with a lot more songs being played at once, the détente song, the diversification song, the China song, the minilateral song, the Gulf unity. Some people will try to play, but I think even that one will be minilateral because, in fact, the Gulf countries are quite polarized at the moment, with UAE on one side and Saudi on the other side, and a lot of the other states just struggling to maintain amicable relations with both, or a lot of people are financially dependent on both. So, you have these other axes that in the region too that have real power, like the idea of an India, Israel, UAE axis, and the idea of a Saudi, Pakistan, Turkey axis. But these
Yes.
also cut straight through the heart of the Middle East. And so they take a polarization and a dispute that's happening in the Middle East and one that's happening in South Asia, and they fuse them together. And that's not necessarily over time going to be beneficial to the prospects and stability on both sides of that, as opposed to kind of keeping a looser and less polarized situation where India is a strategic partner to the entire Gulf and a special friend to UAE. So, so I think there's actually nowhere great to go. I will say that's in the short run. Over time, I think you will see a drift from the Gulf states who don't know who the next president will be, who don't know what this president will do next. Uh, you know, they will drift a little bit into each of these kind of unsatisfying but important alternatives: détente, diversification, great power hedging, minilateralism, Gulf, intra-Gulf self-sufficiency. They'll try all of it because you have to, because they're in a security dilemma where they need security that they don't have. They know after
Thank you.
this, and they don't know exactly know how to get it. So I think from the Gulf perspective, America actually has a real opportunity. We have a real chance. I don't think we deserve the opportunity after the last 3 months, but we have it to remain as a sort of predominant strategic partner to this region. And I think the way to use is to start with security, to focus on Hormuz, which is the most important thing for this region. No matter what anyone tells you about how they also need missiles and nuclear and proxies, you really, Iran was not probably enriching uranium when this war started because we had destroyed it last year, their enrichment capabilities by and large. And the proxies have been badly weakened. So that is the thing now, the center of gravity of this war. If you get it right, then you have tremendous defense opportunities with the Gulf. Everything needs to be hardened. Everything needs to be kind of considered carefully for air defense, missile defense. You can build a shared manufacturing base between an investment base between the Gulf and the United States and Ukraine and others, which helps bring them Ukraine into this mix, which is a strategic benefit or should be to the United States. You can do hardened infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, alternative pipelines, pathways, rail, roads, links, infrastructure. The way I describe it is that 2030 has gone from a sports car to an armored car, Vision 2030.
Thank you.
And I think that's sort of where we can go. And then, frankly, a year ago, next week, you had President Trump in the Gulf. And that trip wasn't about the wars that President Trump was about to enmesh the United States in. It was about business. And the Gulf loved it. It was one of the best trips that an American president has taken to the region, notwithstanding the various complications of the politicization or self-dealing and conflicts of interest. It was an excellent trip. And conveyed an enduring message to the Gulf that business could be at the heart of U.S. Gulf relations. That was new and really important, and I think we got to get back there.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your insightful opening remarks. My next question. The most dominant discourse in today's Middle Eastern geopolitics is the exit strategy for the US. Now, for me, the word itself shows, sounds that the US is on the defensive, and as of now, they're not worried about the long-term strategic objectives with which they began the war. So, what should we conclude from this? Is US simply abandoning its long-term strategic objectives, or at the moment, this exit would be a tactical retreat to come back later to fulfill the long-term objectives? Because you mentioned about Hormuz, and we know that the regime which is left in Iran now is much more hardcore, radical, and much more, I would say, anti-US. So they're definitely going to exploit, and they're going to use this Hormuz leverage that they have again and again in the future. So
Mhm.
a lasting solution is certainly required, but is US even thinking about it, or is US even capable of that? What's your take on this?
Well, are we thinking about it? Yes. Are we capable of it? Maybe. Let's find out. But look, I think we've done a lot more talking about leaving than leaving. Let me put it that way. For 15 years now, we've been talking about how we're going to either pivot to Asia Pacific, now most recently pivot to the Western Hemisphere. Trump's national security strategy from late last year said we're going to having effectively solved the problems of the Middle East, move on to the Western Hemisphere. Uh, so that did not age well, and it never does. I'm sorry to say. We do have very pressing and serious strategic matters in the Indo-Pacific where we have to avoid being overmatched by China in certain specific contingencies that I think are vitally important. We do have to deal with pure and simple Russian aggression that has created a war in Ukraine on Europe's frontier that is, to the United States, totally unacceptable. Uh, well, I should say, I find totally unacceptable. And the United States has had a variety of different positions on over different administrations, but I think needs to be brought to an authoritative end with enough guarantees for Ukraine and the rest of its territory that Ukraine can go on to to live another day, but and with some certainty for its future. But basically, we do have these three theaters that are all incredibly important, and the idea that we're pulling everything from the other two to the Middle East, which in many ways is the third most important of these three. Uh, Not exclusively, Hormuz showed itself to be very important, but pulling high altitude air defenses out of South Korea and Marines out of Japan, who will be part of the future contingencies for setting the conditions for a secure Asia Pacific, and sending them indefinitely to the Persian Gulf, to the Gulf waters, excuse me, is a bitter blow for the United States. So I think that is really a strategic setback, and I hope that we get to rebalance again properly. And that's one of the costs of this war, is that it misallocated U.S. priorities. Uh, but it also, I should say, like, if this war had been successful in dislodging the Iranian regime and replacing it with something more stable at a reasonable cost, that might have been worth it. Uh,
Yes.
uh, I'm not wild about wars of choice. I think we probably shouldn't have done it. I would have probably advised against it anyway. But I might have been forced to conclude, if it had succeeded massively, that it had been incredibly valuable and would allow us to balance our forces better between these theaters. Instead, we have the worst of all worlds, where we're drawing from other regions. Those other regions, at some point, those tides will pull back in the other direction, and they'll pull back hard at some point. We won't be able to keep all of our naval forces in the Persian Gulf for the next, or in the Gulf waters for the next 5 years without serious costs in the Asia Pacific, where China's larger navy is already a major problem for us and for all of our allies. And that doesn't even include the Western Hemisphere, where the administration has used kind of gunboat diplomacy and diverted significant amounts of our naval assets already. So there is a real set of global trade-offs here, even if I don't think China is the most important player in the Gulf. But I don't think that America is leaving the Middle East. I don't think we can. We have to find ways to adapt here. And I think adaptation, in part, means finding a livable modus vivendi with Iran, where we're containing and competing and fighting when we need to, but also creating diplomatic space at a acceptable cost. That got much harder after the last year and a half to do. We could have perhaps done a nuclear deal and skipped this war, and Iran would have had a major missile arsenal, and it would have been a serious issue. But Iran would have been less hardened. It would have faced a succession crisis, which we solved for them by assassinating their leader and replacing him with a pliant tool of the Revolutionary Guard in his son. So it's harder now, that balance between different regions. But I think no American president is really going to be able to uproot us from the Middle East, because it's just too vital to the global economy. And nobody
Yes.
wants to be the president who oversees a nuclear-armed Iran.
Uh, so you just said that, I mean, the US could have gone with the nuclear deal. So, I mean, what I infer from this is that, I mean, if Democrats had been in power, they would have preferred a stable nuclear deal with Iran, right? Am I
So
correct if I
yes, I
understand
mean,
correctly?
I think it's more complicated than that, in the sense that Joe Biden had 4 years. And for 4 years, the Iranians, I think, weren't really interested in a big deal. So we reached a kind of low-level agreement where they would stop enriching, but they had gone very far under Trump and in the first years of Biden, while we were trying to rein them back in, since leaving the deal in 2018, 2019 era. So basically, and drifting out much further. So I do think Trump using the military threat got significant leverage. Also, Trump had leverage because he knew that the Iranians knew basically that Trump was the opponent who had shredded the Obama deal in the earlier era. So if he came along, and they would have more assurance that this would be bipartisan and would be supportable. There were basically no Republicans who supported the Iran deal in 2015. So I think they kind of didn't give Biden a serious opportunity to craft a valuable and meaningful extension to this deal. And even so, they came close a few times. They massacred their own people. October 7th happened. There was a regional war. There were a lot of other distractions in the file. Trump had a golden opportunity here to actually put this file to rest for 10, 20 years. And we would have still had missiles to deal with, and we would still have had proxies to deal with, like we probably will now. He could have done it. He could even have done it after the first time he went to war, which is incidentally a war that achieved serious military objectives for the United States and strategic objectives of extending Iran's breakout time at the cost of foreclosing some diplomatic opportunities and losing visibility into it. But a serious strategic achievement in terms of getting Iran's back from a kind of threshold, borderline threshold nuclear capability into something more manageable to allow time for diplomacy. Even then, we could have negotiated. But that's why this choice at the end of February this year was so fateful, to push us past that and to kind of declare regime change war at the beginning in a way that elicited the most desperate responses from the Iranian regime. And now we can't unsee the things that we've seen. Iran can control the Strait. America can threaten to erase a civilization. We can't unring these bells, and we can only go forward from here.
Interesting points, but I mean, see, if as an outsider observer, I was keenly observing the developments in the Middle East, and also I had several interactions with the Israeli experts and diplomats. Prior to this war, we knew that what happened in June last year, in June 2025, the Iran was bombed, and in January, Iran witnessed major widespread, I would say, internal unrest by their population itself. So somehow, and at some stage, the calculation was that this was the Iran's weakest moment, and this was the best time, since the proxies were all dead, almost dysfunctional, and the Americans and the Israelis were having an edge over them. And I mean, this was the best point of time to neutralize the regime, to dislodge it. So do you think that at somewhere there was some kind of an intelligence failure, or a lack of the proper understanding of the Iran's capabilities? Or perhaps, like, let me put it this way. Like right now, in the current situation, I think many people are saying that Iran is emerging as a great power center in the Middle East. But if the Americans had continued the bombing for 10, 15 days, without, coming to the ceasefire, or without even caring about the Hormuz Strait, do you think that things would have been different, or Iran would be much weakened?
If we had bombed for 10, 15 days more, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, before the ceasefire talk started.
No. I'll tell you, I think at the end of the day, there are some things that a military force can accomplish, and there are some things that it can't. And when you're bombing someone from the skies, you can destroy things very easily, but you have a very hard time dictating any political realities, especially in this century. It's very hard. Maybe in 1929, if you're the British and you're bombing over Iraq, you can terrify the local population. But this is a country where the regime is unmoved by the pain and suffering of its people. It's inflicted a lot of the pain and suffering of its people.
Yes.
I'm sorry to say. And I don't say that, lightly. I'm sure that they're, devastated by it, but they haven't made decisions. What I mean to say is that they haven't made decisions that reflect a desire to minimize the suffering of their people. Instead, it's a culture of resistance. It's a ideology of resistance to the United States, of never capitulating to Western bullying and imperial bullying, of which Iran has suffered a lot over the centuries and in the last century. And the idea that you would just bomb a little more and then they would say, okay, uncle, enough, that's not their system. So ultimately, if you want to threaten them, maybe you can use deterrence and coercion. But once you've sort of put them in a position to lose face and ask them to capitulate and surrender and get nothing, they're just going to say no, even no matter what the cost is. Ayatollah Khomeini said this revolution wasn't started to change the price of watermelons. That is, I always think about that because it's ideological, and a sort of neoliberal mindset, a Western mindset, fails to capture that, I think. So as to whether it was an intelligence failure, I think it's hard to know. When you read the reports, it sounds like the Israelis suggested that given the weakness of the regime and some of the plans afoot, they thought maybe they could have wobbled and toppled over the regime. But that was always a kind of a hoped for outcome, not a necessary outcome. But for Israel, merely weakening, going after, trying it out, creating chaos, making, and diversion and distraction was all kind of to the positive. They were less worried about the implications for the global economy and the Strait of Hormuz. because that's not their issue. And it's also politically beneficial to the leaders of Israel, I think, to be enlisting the United States to be involved in pushing this war, which was very popular in Israel. For the United States, however, I do think for Israel it may be short-sighted, because if this war is viewed as a bad experience for the United States, that will cost Israel in a place where it's at the moment extremely vulnerable, which is American public opinion and political opinion among both Democrats, who are likely to control at least one House of Congress, and also among young Republicans under the age of 50, so not that young, who are now turning away from Israel and toward Palestinians. So this war, which is viewed as something that Israel was one of the most influential champions of, is actually may turn out to be a real strategic liability for Israel, because it may affect its center of gravity, which is that relationship and partnership with the United States. This is the first time Israel and America have actually flown shoulder to shoulder in a war. And if the war goes badly, and it's viewed as a kind of misadventure, that bodes poorly for the US-Israel relationship, I'm sorry to say, which I know has implications for India, which wants to work trilaterally and with others in the region. So I think for Israel, it's one thing. For the United States, I think Trump had seen with the story in Venezuela that he could knock off the leader and work with the number two and use kind of gunboat diplomacy to get everything he wanted at a very reasonable cost. Whether that will work over time is another question, but I think he viewed it as a roaring success. I think that the Iran war, which I knew better, was in many ways a tactical success. I think the problem with it was that it made diplomacy harder, and war tends to beget more war, as we're seeing. We're seeing that cost. But as a tactical matter, they really did weaken Iran. They created chaos. They set back the nuclear program. And after the war, the people went out into the streets, having seen the regime exposed as the hollow paper tiger that it was. Those were real tactical successes. But the strategic failure was to not stop there and to assume that because Iran was weak, what you had to do, instead of negotiating from a position of strength, was to kind of go for it all. When the regime change problem was so big. We didn't even get to it, but had we really armed the Kurdish factions inside of Iran, you would have seen Turkey enter on the side of Iran, probably. Iraq would have been entering on the side of Iran. You would have had a lot of countries swinging to Iran's support to avoid Kurdish separatism. And frankly, you would have had potential for massive chaos in a failed state with 90 million people. Which would be a huge problem for many of Iran's neighbors. One day, I hope that the Iranian regime falls. I hope it very much in my bones. My grandfather is actually Persian, and I would like more than anything in the world to go back to see the places where my family lived. They're Jews from Persia and Shiraz and other places for hundreds and thousands of years. I would love to see those places and be welcomed there and be treated safely and have this cancerous government gone. But as an American with finite resources and clear national interests around the world, I think that regime change in Iran was the wrong policy to pursue, and we're dealing with it. I think the president was told that by many people, including his own vice president and probably his military and intelligence community. So I don't think you can call that an intelligence failure. It was more of a failure of judgment, as far as I can tell.
Failure of judgment. Okay. Well, that's interesting, and certainly because definitely we all read this common opinion that this was a war of choice, and now we can also say that this was a war of poor judgment.
I'm sorry to
Bad
say,
judgment.
I think it is. I think that the goals of the war are goals that I completely support. But the judgment that went into the choice to launch it and some of the conduct of the war, I've found really wanting.
So, as of now, I'm seeing two, I would say, access or like two friction platforms in the Middle East. On one hand, we are witnessing some sort of frictions between the Israel and the US. On the other side, among the Arab states,
Yeah.
we're seeing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of frictions. UAE has left the OPEC, and many people are saying that the next conflict point would be with Turkey. So, given these things, do you think that the Arab states will try to explore other options to deal with Iran? For example, let's say either finding a back channel with the help of Pakistan and China to arrive at some kind of a rapprochement with Iran, or maybe exploring China and Moscow as defense partners, which looks rather difficult, but maybe seeking a back channel arrangement with the help of Pakistan or China to find some temporary or at least an ad hoc peace. What's your take on this?
Yeah, look, I think if the United States is seen to not be prioritizing the Strait of Hormuz and getting it done quickly, they will absolutely do that. This is their economic lifeline. They'll go to Iran. They're already talking with Pakistan, who is talking with China and Iran. They'll go to China. The Emirati leadership already went to China. They sent the son of the ruler in April, went to Beijing. It doesn't mean that they're now with China and not with the United States. It just means that they're talking. And I'm sure they're talking to Iran and they're figuring out what they can get if they need to. They would all much rather do it as part of a global umbrella than cut a temporary side deal that enriches the country that just bombed them. That's embarrassing. It's humiliating. But they're dependent on the security support of the United States and the diplomatic leverage of their superpower partner to get something better. And if nothing better is coming, then that's what they'll do. So that's where we are essentially. I think that's likely, and I don't think that that means they're going to discard the United States. And I should say, there's been some kind of hot talk about a few things that I wanted to sort of knock down. One, I don't think this is a Suez moment, like the moment in 1956 when Britain found itself unable to push to get its way with France and Israel, and the United States kind of held it back and became the predominant Middle East power. And it was one of these sort of baton passes in the world. For the reasons that I've explained, I think we're passing, there's no baton pass because there's nobody to catch the baton uh, in the Middle East. Or anywhere, frankly. China has been remarkably passive beyond its own, the Pacific Rim and beyond its own manufacturing empire that it's building. Remarkable passivity. Maybe wise, I don't know, but um, I think there's no baton pass happening here. There is also long-term damage to U.S. leadership, which I worry a lot about the people-to-people part of this. The Americans coming home from the Middle East, the businesses that maybe don't go back, the college students that never make it to America because of draconian policies. I'm worried that over time we're eroding the sources of our greatest strength. But that's a tomorrow problem, not a today problem. So I don't think we're in a Suez moment. I don't think that Iran has become one of the five great powers, as Robert Pape wrote, simply because they sit on this oil choke
Yeah.
point. I think before we get to anything quite start hyperventilating to such a degree, uh, more military action may happen. Iran is sort of weak in front of its own people. All sorts of things can happen here that would change that calculus. I think that was a sort of very overheated perspective. But Iran did gain serious global influence by making real this threat that they've had for 47 years. And the reason they did that is because they were backed into a corner by policies of the United States and Israel, is the reason that they chose to do that. They had the intent to do that because of their priorities, which are inimical to most of the countries in the world. But they made the choice to exercise that intent because of the United States and Israel's policies, which I think were mistaken.
Thank you. Thank you. I just have a few more questions for you because, it's so
Please, yeah.
exciting that, I guess, we feel like learning more and more from you. Eh, so now coming to Turkey. Turkey, to me, it comes as the most puzzling and the most disturbing actor in the Middle East. On
Mm.
one hand, we see this very highly Islamized Erdogan regime, which has its great ambitions, reviving the Ottoman Caliphate or a new form of Ottoman Caliphate, extending influence, Turkic influence in Central Asia. Also, they're trying to win over the South Asian Muslims, supporting
Mm.
Pakistan and its proxies. They have their differences with Israel. The frictions are getting more and more stronger. And we are already talking about this new axis coming up in the Middle East, in which Turkey will be pitted with Pakistan against Israel, Greece, India. And but on the other hand, we also see that Turkey is a part of NATO, and Turkey has an excellent equation with the Americans. President Donald Trump seems to like Mr. Erdogan a lot, and even in this war, Turkey's whole stance was very ambiguous. Definitely, I mean, they were trying to play some kind of a, I would say, middle ground between the Iran not taking sides or not even opening their cards properly. And we also talk about Turkey becoming the focal point of the Islamic NATO with Pakistan. So, how do you look at this? I mean, Turkey is a very disturbing actor. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
want
think
you to make
Turkey,
sense of Turkey's role. Like,
it's a great question. And I think, Turkey contains multitudes. Uh, it seems to have many of the elements that you described. You have both the kind of populist, authoritarian, Islamist ruler who is happy to extend that ideology beyond his borders, uh, who is seeking to kind of anchor a certain ideological vision within the Ummah of Muslims around the world. And that has a serious risks attached to it. And you have a very pragmatic and kind of wily geostrategic player
yes.
who's capable of transacting with the United States, and working with President Trump or President Biden on difficult issues. You know, and you have Turkey, who's sort of got huge industries like construction and drones, excellent competitive drones, which are going to flood, I think, the Middle East and beyond over time, and have proven quite effective in Nagorno-Karabakh and other places. So we're going to have to deal with this Turkey that contains multitudes, and on different issues, it's very hard. I think for Israel, Turkey is in kind of drifted from a friend into something that's unfortunately closer to an adversary. They're quite worried about. They know how powerful Turkey is. They know how near Turkey is, so much closer than Iran to Israel, and how much more enmeshed it is in the politics and partnerships of NATO, of the United States, of Syria, their neighbor. So this is a much more formidable state in some ways, but they're really worried about it. That doesn't mean they're going to bomb it like they bombed Iran, because I think that would be true devastating folly and help break the NATO alliance and all sorts of other things. Uh, but it does mean that they view it as at least a strategic competitor. They have very different visions for Syria. And I think Turkey's vision, which is really kind of trying to stabilize the state under Ashara, this Islamist ruler, um, is probably has much more support than Israel's vision, which is to weaken the state and carve out portions of it for various Israeli aligned actors. That's not popular with Syrians or with a lot of the Arabs, to be honest. So I think Turkey probably has the better part of that argument, even with the United States by and large, when it comes to US interests. So this is a really complex actor, complex inside Turkey, complex outside, vexing because of his country's support for Islamists in various regional conflicts and elsewhere. But he controls a very big and important country, and will have to be dealt with, partnered with where we can, pushed back on when engaged in unhelpful activities, and factored into almost everything that happens in the Levant, certainly and beyond.
That's interesting. I remember because with this you mentioned about Syria. I guess some time back I was in the Middle East. I was visiting different countries. I had one Indian colleague, a slightly hawkish man, but a strict vegetarian hawkish man. He suggested the Israelis that why don't you completely split Syria into multiple parts, and do regime change, this, that. Then he suggested regime changes for like three, four states in the Middle East. Israelis shot back, why don't you do the regime change in Pakistan? So this
Well,
remind
the
on a
Israelis at
just
this
mention.
point have taken out the leadership of Iran. They helped weaken Assad and the IRGC to the point that the Syrians changed their leadership. They've
Yeah.
taken out the leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is arguably like regime revival for the Lebanese state, which, as opposed, and in some way, which has been under the thumb of Hezbollah and is now trying to get out. They've killed generations and generations of Hamas leaders, and
Yes.
so there's been a lot of changing regimes, but I think what hasn't changed is the sense that they're dealing with a degree of encirclement, and ultimately that I think unfortunately have proven far better at breaking things with one of the most impressive military intelligence capabilities and fusions of any country in the world than they are at assembling and wiring political outcomes to change those things and do more than kind of buy time at the cost of goodwill, which is, I think, a good part of what they've done in the near abroad. Some of these changes have been massive. Fall of Assad, was massive because there were forces beyond them that were able to sweep it forward. In Lebanon, it's a verdict. The killing of Nasrallah was incredibly important and weakened Hezbollah, and at least created a big opportunity. Whether it devolves into something else as it's now happening, or we'll see. And similar for Iran. But I think the problem is it's a lot easier when you have a powerful military, but you don't have the partners inside the country to break things, to bomb things, to threaten, coerce, destroy, than it is to say, okay, here are the people who will rule Iran next and create a friendly country to the people with the military capabilities to dislodge the old leaders. So that's where we are, and that's the fundamental problem and dilemma of this region, is that there's a lot of more military power than political craftsmanship.
So two final questions. We see that, as far as South Asia is concerned, that Iran's so-called symbolic victory, or the edge, or at least the perception of Iran's victory, has ended up emboldening the proxy actors, the non-state terrorist actors in South Asia. And we've seen that across the spectrum, like Shias and Sunni Muslims, both, at least an overwhelming majority of them, were supporting Iran in this. Given the fact that this new regime is likely to be much more hardened and I would say, hardliner, do you expect it to engage in more of asymmetrical warfare and I would say intensifying terror attacks against the US?
Yeah,
This is my first question.
it's a great question. I think they have the capabilities to do that in many cases, not necessarily inside the US, but against US targets. I think that they have calibrated those choices in favor of using other tools so far. There have been times in the past where they went after Americans in Thailand and Germany, and not to mention in Cafe Milano in Washington, D.C. A lot of different plots. I don't know if that's happening right now. I don't have access to intelligence these days. As a member of the former administration and a think tank expert, I no longer hold those clearances. Look, it wouldn't surprise me if there was that kind of plotting happening, but I think that there are also reasons why they wouldn't want to do that kind of thing, to lose the international sympathy that they've gotten from all these places. In 1993, 1994, they bombed a Jewish community center in Argentina and killed, hundreds of people. This is a regime that has done terrible things for a long time and is certainly capable of terrorism at a high intense level. That Amia bombing was a perfect example of the kinds of terroristic actions that this regime is capable of. But they haven't exercised that capability consistently, I don't think. So we'll see whether they decide that that's warranted by the situation, or maybe they have more to gain by playing a asymmetric game within the Gulf right now and holding those capabilities for another day.
Thank you. Thank you. So coming to the last question for today's session. Now that let's come back to India, Delhi. So we see that Pakistan is, I don't know if Pakistan is a mediator or a postman, but definitely Pakistan is playing some important role in the ongoing ceasefire process. And we all believe that that's going to add to Pakistan's strategic weight in the Middle Eastern affairs. And I would say, looking at the future trajectory of the Middle East, it seems that Pakistan will continue to play this important role, not just in the ceasefire, but also in the Middle Eastern affairs, given that it has a history of strategic agreements with the various Arab players. Its armies have trained the Arab forces, and now the Arab states need to build their own militaries. Even the Americans need to ramp up the defense arrangements with the Arab states. So in that also, Pakistan can be a critical factor because of its trained professional army. Now, if that is the case, it seems that the Americans will be more vulnerable to Pakistan because they need Pakistan in the Middle East, and that adds to India's tensions. Let's say in the future, if Pakistan continues terror attacks in India, or if we have a warlike situation with Pakistan in the future, then do you think that, the Americans will not be able to help India, or at least, side with India in the manner that they used to do it earlier?
It's a great question. Pakistan has had a ability to make itself relevant one way or another and to not be ignored, that goes back a
Yes.
long way. And I think they've done, in many ways, a truly brilliant job of making themselves relevant to the Trump administration at a time when the strategic logic of the United States would have pushed the country heavily toward India. Um, Instead, Pakistan seems to have figured out how to ingratiate itself to the president, nominating him for a Nobel Prize, giving him credit for negotiating with ceasefire between India and Pakistan. So he seems the Munir the team seems to have figured out how to inject itself into this strategic context. To be honest, brilliantly. And I think nobody had this on their bingo card, as we say in America, that these two years in, this much of the world's attention would be in Islamabad, not negotiating over a crisis that Pakistan was at the center of, but negotiating with Pakistan over a crisis that America was at the center of. That's a very unusual turn of events. I don't know how it will play over time. I think they certainly have goodwill and attention and traction with the President of the United States and the Vice President, who also went to Islamabad. You know, President Trump was talking about going at some point, and the idea that you would make it to Islamabad before you make it to Delhi, I think has got to be very troubling to many of my friends in South Asia. So, yeah, maybe I think it's an issue. I'm not sure how President Trump will respond. From my perspective, the bigger question than our relationship with Pakistan, though, is our relationship with India. Honestly, that's the strategic motherlode for Pakistan. I know India. I mean, for India, this is a perpetual issue, irritant, threat, danger, etc. But for the United States, India is a giant partner with the whole world that needs U.S.-Indian cooperation, far beyond the question of Pakistan. And so, um, to me, the bigger question is how can we get our own bilateral relationship right? For 25 years, this was kind of, you know, the expression of George Kennan was that diplomacy is constant gardening, watering the plants so that they grow. You know, this was watered, the U.S.-India relationship, so lovingly for 25 years by all of our leaders, and then kind of neglected in some ways over this last year as we kind of found ourselves in a period of unexpected friction and difficulty. I recently wrote an op-ed about in the Financial Times about why America needs ambassadors in other countries. And I think India actually, with Sergio Gore as a close advisor to the president, who can maybe draw in the president to revive and renew and replenish this relationship with India, is actually in some ways, a very good pick to try to make right what went wrong over the last year. Which is not easy at a time when we're engaged in war and all the rest of it. And just frankly, like the temperament factor is a factor. But I think I'm still hopeful that we can find a way, regardless of what America is doing with Pakistan at the negotiating table, where Pakistan both has its own serious role and is kind of a cutout for China and Saudi and others. You know, I hope that we can find a way to focus on the bigger picture. I do think Pakistan is playing a serious role, though, I will say, because the U.S. negotiating position here, the U.S. negotiating capability below the leader level and the elite level of the people sitting at the table is thinner than it has been. The connectivity between the U.S. negotiators and the U.S. expert community, their ability to do the kinds of, be their own back office, let's say, to turn Pakistan into a postman, to use your phrase, and do that work themselves, that capacity doesn't exist in the same way. So they'll be reliant on the mediators to do more to create the substance of the negotiation than another team would be. So I think I don't think that the postman metaphor is probably quite right. But I do think that that the Pakistan problem at the heart of this shouldn't mask the larger imperative, which is our two giant democracies finding a way to do it better than we did it in 2025.
Well, that's interesting. Actually, I mean, with Pakistan, I have seen that Pakistan has somehow this unique ability to practice real multi-alignment. I mean, it can be friends with enemies and still, make its way through it. It can be friends with China. It can be friends with US at the same time. In the
Mhm.
future, let's say, even if China becomes more important in the Middle East, Pakistan, that's certainly going to add more to Pakistan's weight. And in that case, also the Americans will need Pakistan, because if there is some kind of a negotiation back channel stuff required with the Beijing, Pakistan can be very helpful. Pakistan was the one which supplied, which transferred, smuggled those nuclear blueprints to Iran, and interestingly, the hotel in which the ceasefire talks were supposed to happen, the Serena Hotel, it's quite close to that tailor shop, which was known as Good Fabrics Tailor Shop, and that shop was frequented by this Pakistani rogue nuclear scientist, Abdul Qadir AQ Khan. So that
Of
was the
course.
place where AQ Khan handled those nuclear blueprints of 12 kiloton nuclear weapons, which were detonated by China in 1962. So the blueprints were given to the Iranians at that particular spot. So it's such an irony. But on the other hand, for India, definitely, we are always very hopeful about the great relationship, civilizational bonding, shared values with the US. But when it comes to the core concrete details, somehow things, don't work the way we planned them. And I mean, like today, if you see in India, the Indians are really confused. You'll find a lot of senior generals and diplomats, on one hand, they're talking aggressively about India's great civilizational partnership with the Iran, which I've always contested with proper, valid arguments in my write-ups. But at the same time, on the other side, they want to be friends with the Israel and with the US. So this kind of dichotomy, this kind of confusing situation makes it extremely difficult, for India to to come at some kind of a consensus, or some kind of agreed objectives with the US. But anyways, this is a much bigger topic, which can definitely taken up at some stage in the future. So my very warmest regards and thanks to you for joining us today. And it was an excellent discussion, I must say. And definitely, I mean, we are going to see your strategic forecasts coming true in the region and interesting times ahead. So we'll have many more opportunities to discuss these things ahead in the future. Thank you very
Very
much.
good. My pleasure to see you. My only regret is that I'm not there with you in Udaipur.
Please come anytime. Okay, I would love to see you here again. Whenever you want. I mean, we had a wonderful time with you at MPHED and would love to host you again in the future. Okay,
I'm looking forward to it.
thank you.
Wonderful. Take
Thank you.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks.